All right, everyone who's watching me live, you have to find me again. So I hope that we get this going quickly. Okay, we are in Genesis chapter 16 now. We're moving on through this whole thing with Abram and his descendants. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abram agreed to what Sarah said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with her, and Hagar conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now she knows she's pregnant and despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." "Your slave is in your hands," Abram said. "Do with her whatever you think is best." We're in chapter 16 now of verse 6. "Do whatever you think is best." And Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. Now, I want to go ahead and come back to the beginning of this chapter. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Oh my goodness. This is the turning point that we see a catastrophic decision that Sarai and Abram make. God, at this point, she's not doubting that God is sufficient. She's doubting that she has anything to do with this covenant. This is an Abram thing, not a Sarah and Abram thing. But the Lord is going to put down his foot and say, "No, Sarai, you are important to the covenant too." But this is the dangerous part of this, where she says, "I can build a family through her." This is her trying to take what God has given them and said, "God has promised you all these things, but now I've got to make sure that they're happening, because they're slow in coming, because, well, maybe the Lord is going to do it this way or that way. So I have to make sure that the Lord's promises come true." Wow. Okay. We are guilty of the same thing whenever we decide, well, in order to help God along, then I'm going to do this and such. We see this example there are two really prime examples of this in the Word when we get on later. Solomon did this. Solomon means peace, shalom. So Solomon's name actually meant peace. And when David was told he could not build the temple, then Solomon knew that he was the one. And God said, "Solomon, your son, he is going to build the temple because he is not a man of war. And there's blood on your hands, David, and Solomon's going to get to do it because there's no blood on his hands." So Solomon took that as because you don't have war and don't have blood on your hands, you get to build the temple, which was right. But in order to keep from having blood on his hands anymore, Solomon did something that as Dr. Stephen Manley would say, he self-sourced. He decided, you know what, I am going to make sure that I don't ever go to war. Because in order to build the temple, I have to be pure enough, my hands have to be clean enough, so I'm going to self-source and I'm going to make covenants with all these countries around me by marrying the princesses, by marrying the king's daughters, and all of the people around, so that we don't have to go to war with them. But in order to not go to war with these people, that means I also need to bring the girls, the women, and I need to bring their idols, so that we will, when you had a covenant between you and another country or another people group, then your God became their God became your God, and everybody was good. That way there wasn't any religious persecution, there was no religious differences, there was nothing between them that caused a great deep-seated conflict. It became one nation under all of the gods. It doesn't matter. And that's what Solomon did. Is that he said, you know what, I'm going to fulfill God's promise in my life, that I am the man of peace, and that I'm going to make sure that there's peace, and I'm going to bring these false gods. That set the people up for 400 years of burning their own children at the hands of the false gods, of going to the male prostitutes. 400 years of sodomy, 400 years of them throwing their own children to their deaths. That was Solomon self-sourcing himself and saying, you know what, I'm going to make sure God's promises come true. And that's what Sarai did. She said, I'm going to make sure God's promises come true. Because he's slow in coming, because certainly he can't do it on his own. He's going to need my help. Okay, the other example of someone who did not do that, who did not self-source, who did not say, look, God's promises are slow in coming, so I'm going to make sure that they happen. And that was Jesus during the temptations. When Jesus came and Satan came to him and said, I want you to just for a moment, I want you to undo, just for a minute, the sovereignty that you've given God the Father over your life. The incarnation, you being divine. I want you to pick up your power and I want you to do something just for yourself, just to prove that you are who God says that you are, just to prove to all these people. Now I know that you're divine. I know that you're the one and only Son that God sent to fulfill all these promises. But if you will just go ahead and rule the kingdoms, then it will be proved to them. Just go ahead and take up your own ideas about this Jesus as a man, 100% God, and prove that you are 100% God. And I will help you do all of these things. And Jesus said, no. God is going to do it the way God is going to do it. And I'm not going to self-source this because my God is sufficient. God the Father is sufficient. And I am here to represent what it looks like to be in relationship with him through the Holy Spirit for everyone here. And I'm not going to do God's will for him. I'm going to allow God to do with me as he will. And his will be accomplished in my life. That idea of God being sufficient, his promises are sufficient, I'm not going to take them. I cannot fulfill God's promises for him. That's where Sarai and Abraham went wrong. And we still pay the price for that, don't we? So in my life, in your life, let us not think that I can fulfill God's promises. God will fulfill his promises in my life. And just by believing that, it will be counted to me as righteousness. Oh, what joy. Okay, we have a little bit left in this chapter, and we're going to go ahead and finish it up. Y'all catch up with me, and I'll be right back.